This episode of the Unbuilt It podcast is brought to you by Huber Engineered Woods, makers of Advantech subfloor assembly products. Engineered with long-lasting strength, moisture resistance, and nail-holding power, Advantech subfloor is the brand builders trust for quality subfloor. Combine the strength and moisture resistance of Advantech panels with the bonding power of Advantech subfloor adhesive for a solid, even subfloor assembly, perfect for a variety of floor applications. Follow along with builders and their Bringing Their A-Game campaign on the Advantech Subflooring YouTube channel, at Huberwood on Instagram, and their new website. Visit advantechagame.com. Thank you, Huber Engineered Woods.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Unbuilt It podcast. Guess what we got in store for you today? We are going to talk about one of our favorite topics here, air leakage. Now, the funny thing about air is we want it to work for us in a building, but it can certainly work against you in a building. If you've been following along on the podcast, you'll remember back on our rain screen podcast where we said you can't get enough air behind the cladding system to make me a happy guy and to dry out. So that's air working in our favor. But today we're going to talk about how air can create problems for you and the kind of double trouble nature that Peter's going to throw at us. But the first thing that we should understand about air is how it's measured. And for that, we're going to go to Professor Pete. Peter Yost and Jake are here joining me. And Pete's going to give us a real good synopsis on how we talk about air.
Boy. Just so we're clear, when you say Professor Pete, somehow it seems belittling, even though he does actually teach at the college level. Somehow when it comes out of your mouth, it sounds like, oh, Professor Pete.
Listen, I hate both you guys, and there is going to be a podcast where I'm going to walk out on you. It might not be today, but there will be one where you guys just push me to the limit.
I love you too, buddy.
And I hold Peter in the highest of esteem, Mr. Bruton, and it was nothing but the highest compliment when I call him Professor Pete.
Okay. Take it away, Professor Pete.
Wow. And with that. So, yeah, I think Steve laid it out really interesting. You know, moving air can dry things out or get them wet. And so I love to quote Stephen, it's whether you have control or not, right? So if you're controlling the air movement, you can get it to do what you want. And if you're not controlling it, it's going to be double trouble because about 25 to 40% of the total BTUs lost or gained in a building are air leakage. And when air leaks, it carries moisture with it. So if it's going to drop in temperature, which could be warm air leaking out of the house in the winter or warm air leaking into the house during the summer, if it drops in temperature enough, it's going to hit the dew point. So leaking air is a problem both from an energy perspective and from a moisture perspective. So Steve, you wanted me to talk about how we measure air, right?
Yeah, what's the measurement? What's it? How can we understand air better?
Yeah, so we've had ways of measuring the air tightness of building for quite a long time, but interestingly, back in the early 1980s, there were a bunch of building science folks in the Princeton, New Jersey area, and when they were looking at the utility bills for some homes, they couldn't get the utility bills to align with their understanding of the heat loss of the building. And somebody was crawling around in an attic and there was just air roaring through from the inside of the house to the outside. And I think he kind of dope slapped his head and said, oh my goodness, you know, our calculations are ignoring convective heat loss, just focusing on the conductive or what's controlled by insulation. And that was the beginning of us understanding how serious air leakage is in terms of, BTUs leaving a building in the winter, coming in during the summer. And so all of a sudden we had to figure out, well, how do we decide if a house leaks air, how much it leaks? And that's where we come upon one of our most important tools, which is a blower door. And in fact, it's in the code now, right? For the first time in quite a long time, the only performance tool we have to measure the air tightness of a building is woven into the code. Jake?
Yep. So it actually became part of the code in the United States in 2009. And it didn't say the word. Yeah, it didn't say the word mandatory, though. I went back and looked because I have 2009 and 2012. It does not say mandatory in 2009. It says mandatory in 2012. And I would say there's a couple things that strike me about that. Number one, 2012 was 8 years ago, multiple code cycles ago. My state has still not adopted this statewide, and people still, builders still have their heads explode when you tell them they have to be under 3 ACH 50 in our climate zone. And yet, I had a conversation a few years ago with Gary Nelson at Energy Conservatory, the tech blower door, and Gary was telling me that they had, air leakage numbers 1 ACH 50 and under in Canada 25 years ago, or 35 years ago, that they've been achieving this, or that Sweden has been doing this for nearly 40 years.
As long as they've been making meatballs.
1 ACH 50. I knew that there was a meatball joke coming as soon as I said Sweden. So it's a really interesting thing that it's 2020, and I still talk to people that doesn't my house need to breathe? There's no way we're ever going to build a house that's 3 ACH 50 or under. I'm not paying for all those extra building materials to keep my house from leaking. That's silly. We've been doing it this way for 40 years. Also, as an aside, I had a builder say, I've been doing it this way for 35 years. And his mentality was clearly him trying to say, I know what I'm doing. Do you think that when we went from hanging animal skins over window openings to using glass, that there was a guy standing there holding some animal skins going, I've been doing it this way for 30 years. Don't try to tell me that glass is the future and that this is going to work. You're
unfortunately, Peter's the only one that could reference a thought like that.
But doesn't that sometimes seem like what it is? Like, it's 15 years from now, are we really going to have to look back and say, yeah, I spent half my time talking about air leakage from a standpoint of houses need to breathe?
Well, here's, I mean, to do that, to continue that conversation, you know, Peter and I went to work at Building Science Corporation in 96, and we were having these conversations back then, right? Because Joe came down from Canada. So when you sit here and say, well, 15 years from now, are we going to do this? Well, that was 30 or 24 years ago, right? And we had that conversation. And we're still having the conversation of, is it too tight or not too tight? But I want to go back even further to what Peter, he had a really good comment that I want to go back to. Dope slap. No. But in your comments, Peter, as always, you're very informative, and I just want to make sure that all the listeners caught exactly the width of the spectrum that you talked about, because one of the conversations that I have frequently when it comes to air leakage and just energy in general is people associate air leakage and energy loss with cold climates, climate zones 5 and 6. They don't realize that you have energy loss in Miami, Houston, and Phoenix. It's just the reverse.
Anywhere you're paying for...
That it's our summer. It's not that you get air leakage because hot air wants to run out of the building. It's hot air wants to move towards cold air. So if you pay for air conditioning, then you're fighting Mother Nature's heat. If you're providing heat in a building, then you're fighting Mother Nature's loss of that heat to warm her cold outside. So if you're wherever you are in the country, you need to understand when we talk about air leakage, it exists in both realms, meaning whether it's going out or coming in, it's just depends on the climate, dictates the direction. But I want to commend you, Peter. That was like spot on when you talked about, or in the summertime, because in the Northeast, we get to be both, right? We get to be cold in the winter, but we get to be Phoenix in the summer. And so air leakage works in both directions for us.
just for one more like numbers perspective, in 2012, Lawrence Berkeley Lab did a study about air leakage, and they considered 130 million homes in the United States. And if those homes were all reduced to 1 ACH 50, their prediction was $22 billion annually saved on heating and cooling bills.
Yeah, and the really
that
cool,
is a huge amount of money.
And it's almost, is it really aggravating to argue about this, especially when it's not just the energy penalty. If that air is moving, it's carrying moisture with it, and it's creating other problems as well, either durability issues or indoor air quality issues.
Or comfort from a pollen and pollutant infiltration standpoint.
Yeah, so, to get air to leak, you need a hole, a driving force, and then a second hole. And so what are the driving forces? Wind. Wind can make air move from the inside to the outside of a building. Stack effect. Stack effect is like a hot air balloon. In a tall building, when it's really cold outside, you can get a lot of cold, dry air pulled in at the bottom of the building and a lot of warm, moist air getting pushed out the top. And then the last way you can get air moving is if there's a mechanical fan of some sort. So if you've got a AC system and it's in the attic and it's leaking in the attic, you're probably pressurizing the attic and depressurizing the house. Well, if you're doing that, that's a pressure difference, and that's going to create air leakage. So there's a bunch of different ways.
Or a power vented roof vent.
Or a power vented roof ventilator. Yeah, another favorite. But so how do we compare houses, and why does the code use ACH 50? So,
well, how about we go super nerd and I read what the code actually says?
Oh,
please!
I know that Steve's going to shake his head. So this is the IRC 2018. It's the energy efficient category. So it's like N1102.4.1, or the R number is 402.4.1.2. I know somebody's going to ask, so we may as well just. It says the building or dwelling shall be tested and verified as having an air leakage rate not exceeding 5 air exchanges per hour in climate zones 1 and 2, and 3 air exchanges per hour in climate zones 3 through 8. Testing shall be conducted in accordance with, and then it gives a ResNet standard, and it says, which is 50 pascals of pressure or 0.2 inches of water column. Steve, do you know what 0.2 inches of water column is? Do you know what that means?
Yes.
Because we talked about it. It basically means that if you were to take it in
Wheaties, and I had another bowl this morning.
Okay.
So just be
in
prepared.
A cylinder. That's what is it? What was it? 3/16. What did you say it was, Steve? It's less than 3/16 worth of water column sitting on top of something, or virtually nothing.
And it's actually it's like 0.2000069. So just saying.
You want to know it? It's actually 0.200939 equals 50.00 pascals. I looked it up because I was interested.
So you better come at me.
We're going to go full nerd on each other here.
So 50 pascals.
50 pascals of pressure.
Yeah. So
and
why do we pick
Peter,
that?
would you like to? Yeah. How are we going to quantify that?
So what they wanted to do was pick a pressure that was as low as they could get away with, but that got consistent results. So it turns out that 50 pascals is roughly equivalent to a 20 to 25 mile per hour wind. So that's
on all surfaces of the house.
Yeah.
Because you're pressurizing the whole house, right?
Right. Or you could think of it as, wind pushing on one side of the building, creating a positive pressure and then an equal negative pressure on the other side. But it would move air through it, right? And that's what a blower door does. But so what's a pascal? Well, there's 6,895 pascals in 1 pound per square inch. So what does that mean? It means 1 pascal is a really frickin' small number or amount of pressure. And 50 pascals is exerting enough pressure to get consistent results but not damage anything. because we have a choice, right? We can set the fan up so that it pulls air out of the house, and then we're depressurizing, or we could spin around the fan and turn it so that it's pressurizing the house to 50 pascals. It turns out it's a lot easier to depressurize because it pulls everything in the house closed, like bath exhaust vents, the kitchen range hood, even the windows on their seals get pulled in a little tighter.
Casement windows, yeah.
So it's an easier test to do than to pressurize the building. So what is the fan? The fan is connected to a pressure gauge. And so the fan is measuring cubic feet per minute being pulled through it. And the pressure gauge is telling you the force that's developing this. And so it's the relationship between how much air is getting pulled through at a certain pressure. The really interesting thing is that that's not what you report for the code, right? We don't do cubic feet per minute at 50 pascals. We convert that to ACH 50, which is air changes per hour. Why do we do that? Well, we do that because let's say I had 2,000 cubic feet per minute being pulled through at 50 pascals on a 900 square foot apartment, right? And what if I did the same thing and I got the same number in a house that was, 12,000 square feet? Well, it's not just how much air is moving through, it's how big is the building that you're testing. So when you move to ACH 50...
When you say how big, you mean surface area of the 6 sides.
Or because we're using air changes per hour, it's a volume measurement. But the move to ACH 50 normalizes for the difference in the size of the buildings. Because the cubic feet per minute number doesn't do that. And so the code requires the number as a normalized, so we can compare little houses to big houses. And just as another reference, the average new home built in the United States is around 7 air changes per hour at 50 pascals. So an older home could be 12 to 15 air changes per hour at 50 pascals. So how much do you have to air tighten a building to go from, say, 7 ACH to 3 ACH? Well, it turns out that while you have to do a dedicated approach, it's simply not all that hard. Steve, what's the tightest house you've ever built? Or either of you, right? You actually worked on one together. And what's the lowest number you guys achieved for ACH 50?
You did it, man.
The lowest we've achieved is 0.06 or 0.07, but that's cheating with aero barrier. Without aero barrier, we were in the 0.3 range, so half of passive house.
Yeah, but I've done them without aero barrier at 0.16-ish.
Yeah, so 0.16 is like, what, 20 times?
That's probably the air leakage around the blower door.
Around the blower door. So,
you know what's interesting? I'm gonna throw this out there because this is baffling me. When we did that house at 0.16, I was with the builder. We had the blower door, and I said, "Okay, let's have some fun." We took a spade bit and started drilling like 3/4-inch holes through the zip wall. The dial really didn't move that much.
Doesn't move. We did that. We did that on the slabless slab house that you and I did together, Steve. And after doing it, beside the 2 biggest lessons, number 1 was that spade bit doesn't move the needle much. Number 2 was do it while you're pressurizing the house, because if you depressurize, all that stuff goes right in your face when you drill through the.
Note to
So
self.
so you talked, Peter, about that ACH number is more consistent to show how it relates across different size buildings. But doesn't that mean if my building is 900 square feet, it doesn't take as much air to exchange all of the air in the building? So the air leakage is more important and affects my number more on a 900 square foot building than it does on a 7,000 square foot building, right? Can't I cheat the system by building a bigger building and having technically more leakage because it's more air exchanges to pull that air out?
Yeah, actually, this is one of the big complaints with air changes per hour is that it makes it a lot easier to achieve that number for a really large building and a lot more difficult to achieve that same number for a small building.
Hey, and just for the record, the .16ers house, 1,500 square feet.
So a pretty small building.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's really impressive to get down to that number. So one more twist to this, which is, and this is the toughest thing to explain, I think, to lay people as well as building community members. Okay, we're going to make the house tight enough that I then have to introduce mechanical ventilation. Like I just spent all that money.
Is that going to cost me money?
Making the building tight, and now you're telling me it's so tight that I have to bring in outside air. Wasn't I just trying to stop that air exchange? So what's the answer to that one, my buddy Steve?
Well, we're talking about control.
It's in the cell, Peter, because you don't sell air tightness, you sell control, right? So I don't make a building airtight to seal it up. I make a building airtight to gain control, to be able to ventilate it properly, right? So that my ventilation system is inadequate unless I gain control. So you can not do air tightness and then pay for a ventilation system that's doing absolutely nothing, because air's not smart enough to come in just where the ventilation works. It comes in a lot of places. And, for those of you out there, in my years of experience, the building science people have always pointed it out. A couple of my favorites are when you have carpeting at a basement door, open the door and look at the black line under the door, right? And you'll see how much your basement is leaking air, and that carpet has now become the filter. And I think there is some health that you can tie into this, in that if you have carpeting or where's the hardest place to clean? Well, it's right there where the carpeting meets the baseboard and getting stuff out. And where's your walls going to leak? They're going to leak down at that joint. So now you're filtering kind of using the nastiest part of the house as your air filter.
It's interesting too that when we talk about appropriate levels of insulation or appropriate levels of bulk water management, we do say that they both respond to sort of the exposure level, right? So if you're in a really, really cold climate, you need more insulation. And if you're in a really, really stormy, wet climate, you probably need better moisture control. And air leakage is the one thing that stays the same in terms of its importance across climates. Mm-hmm. And that's why there are some people that are really upset that in mild but humid climates, it relaxes to 5 air changes per hour. That's not based on logic, in my opinion, because in hot, humid climates, the concern is not just for the dollars going with that, but the moisture penalty that goes with less air tightness in a building.
Do you think, Peter, that's a carryover from pre-air conditioning era in the code, and people just going, well, it's 80 degrees there, they're not heating, so we're not worried about it? Or do you think that's a lax on someone's just a outright mistake?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I have not looked at the code commentary around the relaxation of the ACH 50 for milder climates. That'd be really interesting to see what the code commentary says about this, because I do not know why it loosens.
Part of me wants to say that the hot climates just haven't caught up yet, right? Meaning that in cold climates, we've had heating requirements as long as we've lived in a cold climate, but we've never really had cooling climates or cooling requirements to the levels that we have them today, right? I mean, the people that grew up in Houston 30 years ago probably didn't have air conditioning in their house, right? I mean, I didn't have air conditioning in the house I grew up in. My dad said, open the window and live with it. September will be here soon, And for Brattleboro, Peter, that's just, hey, this week in August they'll be done quick, so we'll...
2 seasons up here, this winter and last winter.
There you go. But I
So
think
I actually think we may have glazed over. There's a couple important numbers.
No,
here.
we didn't
said
glaze
5
over it. Be quiet.
ACH. Sorry.
No.
Sorry. 5 ACH 50 is Climate Zone 1 and 2. 3 is everybody else. And then if you want Energy Star certified home, it's 2.4. And Passive House is 0.6. Passive House is, as far as I know, the most stringent in the world when we're talking about air leakage numbers in that ACH 50 number. And then we would all agree that you get below 0.6. That's good for you. It's all the same number, right? Like we're talking about how recently has the device been calibrated? How good is the person running it? How well was it installed in the opening? Those sorts of things. So there's some wiggle room there that would you guys agree that anything below 1 is, yeah, good for you?
Yeah, I say under 2 is acceptable. Under 1.5 is good. Under 1 is great. And under 0.6 is outstanding. How's that for a scale?
Okay.
Yeah.
That works. I like that scale.
I will tell you that when I get down to Passive House, the first time I tested a Passive House, I was doing it for a class of Yale students who were up in Brattleboro. And I knew the last blower door test was 90 CFM 50, and I was at 120, and I thought, wow, that maybe the house isn't as airtight now as it was 2 years ago when it was tested. And I had a student who had no background in science or no background in building, and he walks up next to the blower door shroud, and he says, "Hey, Professor Yost, I can feel air leaking around the shroud." And he said, "Do you think that makes a difference?" And I thought, holy crap. And then we taped the seal between the door jamb and the blower door shroud. And guess what it dropped down to? 90 CFM.
Wow.
So 30 CFM difference
Wow.
was just what was leaking around the blower door. So
we have these people that pop up in multiple podcasts. I was trying to get low numbers and was talking about where I thought leakage was on the fan. And I was talking about this with Mike Girton, and Mike walked over to his display case and pulled out a bungee cord, and he was like, "I wrapped this around the fan." And I was just like, "Oh, why didn't I think of that?" It's just a little elastic strap on every manufacturer. It's just a little elastic thing that goes around the fan.
yeah.
Like that's genius. And his solution is a 99-cent bungee cord from the grocery store.
I think you touched on a good point too, Peter. Air tightness degradation, right? There's certainly systems out there. Air barrier. Jake said that we hit a couple of his houses with that, and part of that is because we have perpetual access to those two houses, in that we can go back every 6 months. Which, by the way, Jake, we're about due for a 6-month test on both of those.
We are
to find out, but I think as an architect detailing it, one of the things that I like to think about is will that detail work? Certainly, but will it work a long time, which is very important too. I have a Passive House in Falmouth where the gentleman that does the blower doors there, he's friends with the homeowner, and he stops by once a year, and we probably are 4 or 5 years running now, and we get pretty much the same blower door number every time. Plus or minus maybe like 4 or 5%. But that could be the wind or something.
And I'm hoping we're going to do a podcast on this coming up about just how incredibly dependent we are for our water control layers and our air control layers on sticky stuff. And how long does stuff stay sticky? Because we are super dependent on it for our performance.
Yeah. I know, a lot of people beat me up on wanting to use acoustical sealant. But, I told both of you, I had a friend that was, he built an energy crafted home in the late 80s in Massachusetts and used acoustical sealant there to seal his doors and do a bunch of air sealing. And he was replacing the doors. He knew I was a big fan of it and went over there and checked it out. And it was the same black gooey stuff. Like if he said he installed it yesterday, I would have believed him. And here it is some, 34 years or 32 years later, and it's still the black gooey stuff. And I realize, it's messy. Yeah, you hate it and this, but it's a material that works, man. and it works well.
And even if you were to make an argument that was sealed in an assembly and it lasted longer, I have some on a nail gun from 2014 that's like our extra nail gun that I was doing some stuff at my personal house, so I went to the shop and got it, and it still has sticky acoustical sealant on the outside of it, and I still got it on a shirt that I was wearing when I was using it. So that gun has been not UV protected and not sealed in an assembly, and that's 6 years. If it lasts 6 years, I think we can probably rely on it for a while.
But
Great anecdote,
you know,
yeah.
I think you touched on it a little earlier, Jake. The air tightness. We could sit here and we can brag about 0.16, 30, 45, all of this. But the reality is that, you know, the test there, the Lawrence Berkeley Labs test, you know, I just recently looked it up because I was positioning myself in an argument, if you can believe it. But it was something like 1.3 million permits got pulled last year in the United States. I think that sounds right, but
That's a ballpark for a really strong year.
yeah, and it was.
Yeah.
But think about this: rather than sit here and trying to get houses to the 0.25, 0.30 number, let's just take 60% of those houses and get them under 5.0. Imagine the difference that makes, right? We don't have to. I guess what I'm catering to here is all the builders out there that don't build passive houses, that sit there and say, hey, I build out here in Iowa or Arkansas or Texas or Arizona, Colorado, Massachusetts, wherever, and we don't build passive houses, but I want to build a pretty good house. Well, get that number down into the 2 or 3 range and out of the 5 range. In Massachusetts, obviously, you have to get it under the 3 range, but strive for that 2.5. That's still a good number. You could sit in there with the arguments with the guys that are doing 1.0s and 1.5s. You're not that far off with that number.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, the other thing about that, Steve, is that a lot of folks say, well, I don't need a blower door. I know I built a pretty tight structure.
Ugh.
I distinctly remember the very first time I blower door tested my house. I had installed the insulation. I had installed the drywall. You know, I had installed the WRB, and the sucker leaked like a sieve. I was so angry.
I was just going to say, I can see sleepless nights in this conversation.
Oh, because the blower door just doesn't lie. You know, I mean, and you need that dope slap of tiny cracks count. You know, you can't. You to get control, you need a continuous layer, and boy, I learned that the hard way.
Well, what I think is always interesting is when we're at conferences or something, and you know, you get the one person that comes up and says, "Oh, I really enjoyed your talk," and "Oh yeah, you should see what I'm doing. I am building. Man, we are killing it. We are building some awesome houses. They're super airtight, and you know, just you'd be very proud at what we're doing." It's like, "Oh wow. What's some air leakage numbers? Where are you hitting?" "Oh, what do you mean?" I said, "Well, blower door number." "Well, what's a blower door?" It's like, how the hell can you come up to me and start talking about what is happening at your house if you don't know what the hell's happening, right? What's your favorite line, Jake? I'm throwing it your way.
Trust but verify.
Right.
Trust but verify.
Trust but verify. You don't know until you know. And like Pete, you just said, sometimes the truth hurts.
Hey, I got to share with you guys a recent building investigation, and because the moral is, it's not just how much, it's where. There's a home that I'm working on where the blower door number is 1.2.
I could have took that so many places.
The blower door air tightness number it's a new home, 1.25 ACH50. But there's wintertime condensation that's creating leaks that drip from the cathedral ceiling down onto the living room floor. It's not just how much the building leaks in total, it's where those air leaks take place. In a cold climate with warm, moist air rising, even a small leak in the cathedral ceiling means that warm, moist air is getting pulled through a little place, it's hitting a cold surface and it's condensing, and it's dripping back down in the living room. You know, tell that homeowner what are you complaining about? You've got an airtight home. You know, it's 1.25 ACH50. And his attitude was, thank you very much, but I don't accept the air leak that creates a water leak. You know, so you can never separate out those
in the
two.
Kitchen.
Yeah, if it leaked into the kitchen. Well, you know that famous, when Frank Lloyd Wright built that home in Milwaukee, outside of Milwaukee, and the couple who owned the house was having dinner at 10 o'clock at a dinner party, and a thunderstorm came through, and the water was dripping from the skylights in the Frank Lloyd Wright home onto the table. And so the guy says, get me the architect on the phone. And he calls Frank Lloyd Wright, and he says, there is water leaking onto my dining room table. And you know what Frank Lloyd Wright said?
I do.
Move the goddamn table.
That's fantastic.
But
Sometimes, and that was just one of those times, we're just sitting here recording a podcast, and I forget that we're recording a podcast, and we're just sitting here talking.
no, I never think like that, because if I wasn't doing this, I sure as hell wouldn't be socially active with both of you. So
Yeah, social distancing
funny.
for me and Steve is like 30 miles.
But I think you bring up a good point, Peter, in that when we talk about control layers in general, I'm getting serious here. The having air leakage in the wrong place can take an air leakage problem and make it a moisture problem, and then it becomes a really big problem, right? That the number one killer of buildings is water. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a roof leak. We've both investigated a number of buildings in our time where it rains on the inside of the building.
Yeah.
Right?
You know, Steve, I'll never forget the first time I was doing blower door tests with Kota Ueno at Building Science Corporation in Houston. And everybody wanted to get the number and get out. And Kota was like, well, no, it's not just how much it's leaking, it's from where it's leaking. And he would, while the blower door was running, he would walk around the house and get qualitative information, not just quantitative. And that was a huge lesson for me, because the other guys were saying, Kota, we got the number. Let's get on to the next house. And Kota's like, no, there's two aspects of this. It's how much is the whole building leaking, but from where? And that's a big part of it.
And how, right? Jake and I, we do a bunch of blower tests that are progressive in the building. Right, because you can't, when you do a blower door test and you come up with an air leakage number of, say, 0.6. Well, okay, how do I quantify that number in future endeavors? Like, where is it leaking? Right? I just did a post on Instagram maybe a week ago, Stephen Bazek, architect. But it was the very first time I used Zip 10 years ago. And we built a green box. The window company sucked at delivering, so I talked the builder into sheathing over all the window openings. So the only opening in the envelope was where we put the blower door. We had a slab on grade, zip wall on all the walls, and the drywall was in place on the second floor lid. And we got numbers of just the zip sheathing, and it was at like 0.15, like 32 CFM 50, I think was the number. On that house was probably about 1,900 feet, 2,000 feet. Mm-hmm. We did a flash. We were doing flash and bat on that house. We did a flash of closed cell on it, and it took it down to 25 CFM 50, or 0.12, I believe was the number. So we can see their improvement was there. Then we cut the holes and installed the windows, and it went back up to like 120, 119 CFM 50. And when we got the average, we ended up at like 0.54 or something for our overall number. But you get a really good understanding of, is zip wall a problem, right? And we've all heard the conversation of, should we treat the nails in the field of zip wall, right? Here's a house where we didn't treat the nails, we just treated all the joints, and I was able to take the house to 25 CFM 50, or 32 CFM 50, sorry, right? So what does that suggest? If I can't push air through that hole I sure as hell can't push water through that hole, right? So, doing these multiple tests at different levels help us understand. And one of the quizzes that we throw out there when we do our home building crossroads, if we ever get back out on the road, I encourage you guys to join Peter and I. But I show a slide where we do a positive and a negative pressure test. And a lot of people say, well, why would you do a positive test and a negative test? Well, if I have casement windows and I do a negative test, I get to pull the windows against the weather stripping. I have the potential to make a bad window look good. But what happens when I turn the fan around and pressurize the house on a bad casement window? It actually pushes it away from the weather stripping. If you're a good window, you're going to sit tight against the weather stripping, and I really shouldn't get a differential in number, positive or negative pressure test. But how do I know what a good window is until I put it under the test?
Well, and even the both directions test for if you just have traditional bath fans, that damper closed, damper open. We decided to test envelope on one that we're building right now before windows, and we taped over the bath fans. We did a test. We depressurized. We did a test after we untaped them, and it was the same number, and then we pressurized, and it went from 0.5 ACH 50 for the envelope to almost 1.
Wow.
That's it doubled the amount of leakage in the entire building by having that bath fan involved in a pressurized test. So there's a lot to be gained there. The sheathing is not leaking different when we're depressurizing or pressurizing, or at least we hope it's not. But the one thing that we changed was the bath fans, and that's a big difference. It showed us like those bath fans suck. We should not use those bath fans.
Yeah. The air tightness number required for a material to qualify as an air barrier material is 0.02 liters per meter squared second at 75 pascals. For a 10 by 10 wall to the ASTM standard, the air tightness requirement is 0.2 liters per meter squared second at 75 pascals. That's a 10-fold difference. So, and then for a building to pass to the same level, it's 2 liters. So we went from 0.02 to 0.2 to 2. And the moral there is that as soon as you start building things out of airtight materials, you build in places for air to leak. And so the moral of that is, well, you're never going to get to the airtightness of an assembly or a building unless you start with an airtight material to begin with. Because the natural building process is going to create plenty of opportunities to lose control.
How did we get to this point in the podcast and nobody said continuous yet?
Well, I was waiting for you. I didn't want to burst your bubble.
I just realized that we'd gotten to this point and nobody had bothered to say it absolutely has to be continuous to be effective. Can we just, that's important.
Well, I think we should mention, Joe's red line test. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, but it still bears mentioning, right? On any building section, any detail, section detail, even plan. You can take a floor plan, and you should be able to put a red pen down, trace around the building, and acknowledge continuity and close the loop on that red pen, right? It should be continuous.
Pretty easy to make a jump, that's for sure.
Yeah,
I think that's our wrap up point. Continuous.
Nice.
Know your air barrier and make it continuous.
I did have a point, and it slipped my mind again. The Wheaties are the sugar's counteractive here.
You just wanted to be the last one to talk. Is that what happened?
No, not at all.
Steve is having a senior moment.
No, I'm not.
He's not a senior.
No, I'm not.
Thank you for joining me today, gentlemen. It was a good conversation about air barriers and air leakage. Until next time, this is the Unbuild It Podcast. I'm Jake Bruton.
I'm Steve Bazek.
And I'm Peter Yost.
Thank you. Have a good day.